For most of human history, empires did not fall the way people expected. There was no single moment, no trumpet, no announcement. When civilizations collapsed, those living inside them rarely understood what was happening. They believed the system was strong. They trusted institutions that had existed longer than their own lives. They assumed stability was permanent, and that assumption was always the first mistake. From the outside, history looks clean and organized. We see timelines. We see dates. We see clear beginnings and definitive endings. But inside an empire, collapse never feels dramatic at first. It feels normal, subtle, almost invisible. Markets still open. Money still circulates. People still go to work. That's why collapse is so dangerous, because it doesn't announce itself. The Roman citizen walking to the Forum didn't wake up one morning and say, "Today, Rome will fall." The merchant in Constantinople didn't stop trading because he sensed the end was near. The banker in 1928 New York didn't believe the world was about to change forever. They all believed tomorrow would look like yesterday. That belief, the belief in continuity, is the most powerful force holding empires together, and the very thing that blinds them when the structure begins to break. Every empire in history shared this illusion, the illusion that this time is different. Different laws, different technology, different systems, different people. But history doesn't care about innovation. It responds to patterns. Empires don't collapse because people are evil. They collapse because systems grow too complex, too rigid, too indebted, financially, socially, and psychologically. And the most important part? Collapse always begins long before anyone admits it, long before borders change, long before statues fall, long before history books are written. The real collapse starts quietly inside the system itself, inside money, inside trust, inside incentives. At first, nothing looks broken. Institutions still function, but no longer serve the people they were designed for. Money still exists, but no longer measures value accurately. Leadership still governs, but increasingly relies on force, fear, or distraction instead of legitimacy. This is a stage where empires feel invincible, because the structure still stands. Walls remain tall. Treasuries remain full, at least on paper. Armies still march. But beneath the surface, the foundations begin to rot. History shows us something uncomfortable. Empires don't collapse from the outside first. They collapse from within, and the pattern is remarkably consistent. It doesn't matter if it's ancient Rome, imperial Spain, revolutionary France, or the modern financial system. Different flags, different languages, same sequence, expansion, complexity, debt, distortion, denial, then inevitability. The people living through it rarely call it collapse. They call it reform, adjustment, temporary crisis. They believe stability will return, because it always has before. But history is unforgiving. When trust erodes, when money loses meaning, when systems reward survival over contribution, collapse is no longer a possibility. It becomes a process, a slow unraveling. And once it starts, it follows the same path every single time. In this video, we're not predicting the future. We're not offering financial advice. We're not chasing headlines. We're doing something far more dangerous. We're identifying the pattern. Because once you see how every empire collapses, you can never unsee it. And that's when history stops feeling distant. That's when it starts feeling familiar. Every empire begins the same way. Not with greed, but with momentum. Expansion feels natural at first. Territory grows. Trade increases. Influence spreads. Expansion is celebrated because it works. It brings wealth, resources, and confidence. The system rewards growth, and growth becomes a goal. Rome expanded to secure its borders. Spain expanded to control trade routes. Britain expanded to dominate commerce. Modern empires expand through finance, regulation, and debt. Different methods. Same logic. Expansion creates power. Power creates complexity. And complexity is where the trouble begins. As empires grow, they must manage more people, more systems, more laws, more promises. What once required simple rules now demands layers of bureaucracy. What once relied on trust now depends on enforcement. At first, complexity feels like progress. New institutions emerge. New regulations are introduced. New mechanisms promise efficiency and control. But complexity has a hidden cost. It distances decision makers from consequences. In small systems, failure is visible. In large systems, failure is diluted. When mistakes happen, they're absorbed, postponed, or buried under paperwork, debt, or future promises. Responsibility becomes abstract. Accountability disappears. And this is where empires quietly cross a line. Instead of solving problems, they begin managing symptoms. Instead of correcting imbalances, they compensate for them. Instead of restraint, they choose expansion, because expansion delays pain. This is how debt enters the system, not as a flaw, but as a tool. Debt allows empires to grow without immediate sacrifice. It funds armies without raising taxes too fast. It sustains welfare without cutting power. It buys time, and time feels like stability. As long as the system grows faster than its obligations, everything appears under control. Numbers go up, markets celebrate, leaders are praised. But debt has one rule history never forgives. It demands a future. Empires don't collapse when they take on debt. They collapse when debt becomes the only way the system can function. At that point, growth is no longer optional. It's mandatory. Any slowdown threatens the entire structure. So expansion accelerates. More promises, more leverage, more distortion. Reality becomes inconvenient. And when reality threatens a narrative, empires do something predictable. They change the narrative. Currency is adjusted. Definitions are rewritten. Statistics are updated. Risks are renamed. Problems are no longer problems. They are challenges. Failures are no longer failures. They are transitions. This linguistic shift matters because language shapes perception, and perception shapes behavior. When citizens can no longer accurately measure value, whether in money, labor, or trust, the social contract begins to erode. People stop asking, "Is this sustainable?" They start asking, "How long can this last?" That question alone signals the beginning of decline. Rome debased its currency to pay soldiers. Spain flooded Europe with silver and destroyed its own economy. France financed luxury and wore through debt until trust collapsed overnight. Each time, the same belief persisted. We can manage this. And for a while, they could, until they couldn't. Because complexity does not fail gradually. It holds together until it doesn't. And when systems finally break, they don't break where people expect. They break at the point of trust. At the moment when people realize the system no longer works for them, only for itself. That realization is dangerous. Because once trust is gone, power must replace it. And power is expensive. That's when empires enter the final phase. Not collapse, but denial. Money is never just money. It is memory. It is trust. It is belief made visible. Every empire understands this, even if it pretends otherwise. At its core, money is a promise, a shared agreement that value today will still mean something tomorrow. When that promise holds, societies function. When it weakens, everything else follows. History shows that empires don't collapse when they run out of resources. They collapse when people stop trusting the system that allocates them. This is an invisible breaking point. At first, the changes are subtle. Coins become lighter. Bills become more numerous. Numbers grow, but purchasing power shrinks. The system insists nothing is wrong. Authorities reassure. Experts explain. Data is presented. And technically, everything looks fine until people feel it. Trust doesn't collapse in spreadsheets. It collapses at the kitchen table. When savings no longer protect the future, when wages lag behind reality, when effort stops translating into security, that's when people adapt, not politically, but psychologically. They stop saving. They stop planning. They stop believing. This is where empires lose control. Because once money loses credibility, it stops coordinating behavior. And without coordination, systems fragment. Rome experienced this when its currency lost meaning. Barter returned. Local power replaced central authority. Soldiers demanded payment in goods instead of coin. The state still existed, but its influence faded. In Weimar Germany, money collapsed so completely that wages were paid twice a day. People rushed to spend before value evaporated. Productivity collapsed. Social order followed. The empire didn't fall because of inflation alone. It fell because trust disappeared. And when trust disappears, fear fills a vacuum. Fear changes behavior faster than law ever could. People hoard. They speculate. They gamble. Risk-taking increases because the future feels unreliable. Why wait when waiting guarantees loss? This accelerates instability. Markets detach from reality. Assets inflate. Bubbles form. Not because people are irrational, but because the system rewards speed over patience. This is when empires enter the most dangerous phase. The phase where reality is no longer acknowledged. Warnings are dismissed as pessimism. Skeptics are labeled unpatriotic. Dissent becomes dangerous because admitting the problem would require sacrifice, and sacrifice threatens power. So instead, systems double down. More currency, more stimulus, more intervention. Each solution creates new distortions. Each distortion demands a stronger response. This cycle feels controlled until it isn't. History is clear on this point. Empires don't collapse because leaders are stupid. They collapse because leaders are trapped. Trapped by promises made in the past. Trapped by expectations created by the system. Trapped by the fear of short-term pain. Choosing collapse slowly feels safer than facing it quickly. But slow collapse doesn't feel like collapse at all. It feels like normal life with growing anxiety. People sense something is wrong but can't name it. They feel pressure without explanation. They feel busy without progress. They feel richer on paper and poorer in reality. This cognitive dissonance fractures society. Groups turn against each other. Blame replaces understanding. Short-term survival replaces long-term cooperation. This isn't a moral failure. It's a systemic one. Once money stops functioning as an honest signal, empires lose their compass. And without a compass, direction becomes illusion. At this stage, collapse is no longer preventable, only delayed. And delay always makes the outcome worse. When trust breaks down, empires face a choice: restore balance or impose control. History shows which option they usually choose. Restoring balance requires pain. Control promises order without sacrifice, and control always feels easier in the short term. As systems weaken, authority tightens. Rules multiply. Surveillance increases. Restrictions are framed as protection. The justification is always the same. It's temporary. It's necessary. It's for stability. And at first, many people agree, because instability is frightening. When money feels unreliable and the future uncertain, people trade freedom for reassurance. They accept oversight in exchange for predictability. Empires understand this instinct, so they respond not by fixing the root causes, but by managing behavior. Price controls replace market signals. Capital restrictions replace confidence. Censorship replaces debate. These measures don't solve the problem. They hide it, and hiding reality accelerates collapse. Rome imposed price edicts to stop inflation. Goods disappeared. Black markets flourished. Enforcement grew brutal. The Soviet Union controlled production and prices. Official numbers looked stable. Daily life told a different story. In every case, control replaced trust, and control is expensive. It requires enforcement. It requires compliance. It requires fear. The more control an empire applies, the more resistance it creates. Even if that resistance is quiet, people adapt again. They move assets. They work less. They disengage. Productivity falls. Innovation stalls. Energy drains from the system. Not because people are lazy, but because effort no longer feels rewarded. This is the moment empires begin consuming themselves. The system still exists, but it feeds on compliance rather than contribution. At this stage, collapse is rarely dramatic. It's administrative. Forms replace solutions. Committees replace accountability. Policies replace principles. Leadership becomes symbolic. Decisions are made to preserve appearances rather than outcomes. The empire is no longer steering. It's reacting. And reaction is not strategy. The gap between official narratives and lived reality widens. People stop listening, not because they are rebellious, but because words no longer match experience. That disconnect is fatal, because legitimacy is not enforced. It's perceived. Once legitimacy disappears, power stands alone, and power without legitimacy requires constant escalation, more force, more threats, more control, until the system reaches a breaking point. Not a single explosion, but a cascade. Trade slows, revenue falls, debt spikes, institutions blame each other, citizens blame institutions, trust evaporates entirely. At this stage, collapse accelerates rapidly. What took decades to build unravels in years, sometimes months. And here's the most uncomfortable truth. No empire believes this phase applies to them. Every collapsing system thinks it's managing a crisis, not living through a pattern. They point to history and say, that was different. But history doesn't repeat events. It repeats behavior. The final distortion of collapsing empires is denial. Denial of limits. Denial of incentives. Denial of human nature. Once denial becomes policy, collapse is inevitable. The only unknown is timing. Collapse is not an event. It's a process. And once you understand that, history stops feeling chaotic. It becomes structured. Every empire collapses the same way not because leaders fail in identical ways, but because systems reward the same behaviors under pressure. Expansion without restraint. Complexity without accountability. Debt without limits. Money without meaning. Control without trust. The sequence doesn't change. What changes is the speed. In ancient times, collapse unfolded over generations. People adapted slowly. The system decayed at the pace of human communication. Today, information moves instantly. Capital moves instantly. Fear moves instantly. Which means systems don't just weaken, they unravel. But this video was never about predicting dates or outcomes. History is not a crystal ball. It's a mirror. And mirrors are uncomfortable because they reflect us, not just the past. Every empire believed it was advanced enough to avoid collapse. Rome had roads, laws, and armies unmatched for centuries. Britain controlled global trade and finance. Modern systems have technology, data, and scale beyond imagination. And yet, the same pressures remain. Human incentives don't change. When systems reward short-term survival over long-term stability, collapse becomes rational behavior. No villain is required, just incentives. This is why collapse never feels dramatic at first. It feels reasonable. It feels managed. It feels temporary, until the system can no longer absorb its own contradictions. Then the unraveling accelerates, not because people suddenly panic, but because trust finally runs out. And once trust is gone, systems don't collapse loudly. They hollow out. Institutions remain. Structures stand. Rules exist. But meaning disappears. History shows us something important here. Collapse is not the end of civilization. It's the end of a specific arrangement. Life continues. trade adapts, power reorganizes. But those who fail to recognize the pattern always pay the highest price, not because they are immoral, but because they are unprepared. The most dangerous position during systemic collapse is believing stability is permanent. The second most dangerous position is believing collapse is imminent. Both paralyze judgment. The only useful position is awareness. Understanding how empires collapse doesn't make you cynical. It makes you literate. Literate in incentives, literate in systems, literate in history. And literacy changes behavior. It makes you question narratives instead of absorbing them. It makes you value resilience over appearances. It makes you cautious when others are euphoric and calm when others panic. That awareness doesn't come from headlines. It comes from patterns. This channel exists to explore those patterns, not to scare, not to predict, not to sell certainty, but to understand how the world actually works beneath the stories we're told. If this perspective challenges you, stay with us. History doesn't repeat itself loudly. It whispers first. And those who learn to listen are never surprised. If you found value in this breakdown, consider subscribing. More historical patterns, financial systems, and uncomfortable truths unraveled